I mean, they basically sliced off part of his arm because they yanked him through the window so hard that the guy was, but he was so drunk he kind of didn't really notice that blood was pouring down his arm. They bundle him up. I mean, I'm telling you, these guys were huge, and I had a tiny apartment. It was a studio apartment, right? So you're just like sleeping right in your kitchen, kind of thing. They bundle him up and they take him outside, and they don't let his feet touch the ground. And then the woman says to me, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like,
"What's wrong with me?"
Yeah. And she said, "What are all those posters? Are you a communist? Are you trying to undermine West German democracy?" And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want, And then I realized you do not make jokes with German policemen. I would learn this over and over again.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with a conversation I'm actually excited to have. We've got Professor Jonathan Zatlin. Jonathan, how are you?
Nice to be here with you, Chris.
Just for a brief intro, he's a history professor down there at the University of Boston, doing wonderful things, taking a good look at history, having an objective eye, and writing many, many books. Is that right?
I wouldn't say many, but I try.
Okay. All right. So we're going to cover some kind of dark stuff today, and we're just going to move right into it. So, and this is very topical for the age we're living in right now. So, anti-Semitism, okay, is something that has been around all in the 20th century, even maybe before, I don't know. This is why you're here. What are some of the earliest examples of anti-Semitism, and when did it get popularity in the 20th century? Why?
So I think there are a lot of examples of what I would call anti-Judaism or just Judeophobia, hating Jews that go well before the 20th century that have to do with tensions between Christians and Jews. And it's about theology. It's about how you put the world together in that sense. And there are definitely political components to that. But what happens in the late 19th century is you get the introduction of race, which is regarded as a science. And at that moment, I would say there's something new, and this is what we usually refer to as anti-Semitism, although it's sometimes blurry because you'll have racists who think that based on your body, your biology, you're going to act a particular way, who nevertheless talk about Jews as a kind of confession. So it's a little blurry, but basically the difference is this. If before the late 19th century you were believed in a religious tradition that was regarded as lesser, you could always convert to Christianity and everything would be fine, provided you accepted Christ in your heart. No big deal, right? And okay, sometimes there's some discrimination based on your background, but the idea is you're not supposed to discriminate against converts. But what racists believe is that once a Jew, always a Jew. There's no way to convert, that there's something about your physicality that is going to determine your behavior. So that it doesn't really make a difference what you really believe. So I guess part of what I'm saying is that these changes come about before the 20th century. And there are sort of periodic increases in violence against Jews throughout Europe, but not just in Europe, in the 19th and the 20th century. And they are correlated to some extent with attempts to think about whether or not Jews should be integrated into Christian or Muslim societies. In other words, should they become emancipated? Should they get civil rights? Should be treated equally in this sense? And so some people are perfectly fine with that and other people are not. And the violence very often happens during those debates or related to those debates. One of the points to be made is that we tend to think of, or let's say the generation certainly before me and two generations before that, particularly German historians would argue Hitler came, he was some kind of a magician, he mesmerized entire people and brainwashed them into believing that that they needed to be anti-Semitic. And nothing could be further from the truth. There was an enormous amount, it permeated German society, not just German society, but also German society. And that kind of anti-Semitism did lead to a lot of violence. So you have pogroms, riots against Jews, that sometimes led to death, but certainly a lot of property destruction. in Germany and other places well before World War One, but through the war, during the war, and after the war. So it's not as if the Nazis sort of arrived, thought, gee, we really don't like Jews. Can we convince everybody? Can we, it's a virus, and if we can inject it into everybody's brains, then they'll think away. It was there, and it didn't require the Nazis to use propaganda to basically make people familiar with the arguments. The question is why people would go from, racism comes in different forms, right? It could be, I don't feel comfortable around those people, or I feel put down because I'm white, to I don't want those people playing with my kids, to I will never have dinner with them, I don't want to be in the same neighborhood, I don't want to live next to them, to I don't want them in my city, I don't want them in my country, I want to make sure that they don't belong. In fact, maybe I need to expel them, and if I can't expel them, maybe I need to take more severe steps. And before 1933, you had that whole spectrum of ideas, not just in Germany, but in other places too. So again, it's not like Hitler wrote a book and the plans were there, and then he gets into power and he's just simply tells people that's what we're going to do. I think it's far more complicated than that.
And you had people like Goebbels and stuff who even dated Jewish girls early on in the early 20th century, and then at some point got their hands on anti-Semitic literature that had already been written. And
no, he did date a young Jewish woman, and his diary is filled with anti-Semitic invective. What he did basically is we were talking about masculinity before. This is a really big issue. He had all sorts of issues with his own masculinity, and so those moments where he was feeling particularly fragile or rejected or what have you, he would use his inner anti-Semitism to basically accuse her of treating him badly because she was a Jew, not because he did something. He's a highly insensitive, narcissistic jerk. What I wondered when I was reading about this is, what was she like? What was she thinking? It didn't last that long, but they did go out for a while, right? So he treated her really badly, and when he didn't get what he wanted, and he was an extremely needy guy, then he would trot out things like, I'm being treated badly and it's because she's a Jew. Yeah. So it's not that he didn't know already. He didn't like Jews from the get-go, but I do think that there's a moment where his lack of success in life became increasingly more important. He was radicalized by a variety of things, and then just became part of this far-right scene that was so typical of Weimar Germany.
This combination of being addicted to anger and then on the flip side saying that it can actually get you incredible amounts of power by spreading it.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, I was really surprised to read that he did that. And it's like, and also I felt bad for her in the sense that she was probably a woman in an age where traditionally women couldn't even say or anything against a man. So it was probably just beholden to his insane narcissistic bullshit.
Yes, again, very well put. There's no consent here, right? Because it wasn't possible for women to make clear whether or not a no really was a no.
Yeah.
And he certainly wouldn't have taken a no for a no. Yeah, no. Toxic doesn't go that far with someone like him.
Yeah. I like reiterate for everybody, before we started talking about testosterone and machismo and stuff being at the beginning of the recipe of the cake that is fascism. Like when you get started, you absolutely have to have a dash of narcissism and a dash of testosterone. And
well, I wouldn't want to, I want to push back a little bit, because I wouldn't want to pathologize people and say that, the Nazis were all a bunch of sociopaths or something like that, or borderline personalities or something like that. A lot of them. So first of all, I think these are mainstream people. A lot of them are really cultured, upper middle class. They're aristocrats as much as they're also working class people. They come from, it's a mass movement. So one has to be careful about saying they're all thuggish in some way.
Okay.
But I would say at the same time that there's a way in which a lot of the leaders in particular, but a lot of the men who are involved feel disempowered somehow. Whether it's, Germany losing a military, losing a war that the military had pretty much lied about that they were losing. So it comes as a surprise, and everybody feels, and it's a bizarre thing. How do you personalize a state? Yes, everybody lives together at some level in a state and definitely was touched by the war, whether it was less food to eat or actually fighting, and a lot of people died. But at that moment, a state doesn't have feelings. And to say that Germany has been humiliated, what you're saying is, I feel humiliated. And that sense of being disempowered as a man, the construction of male personalities around things like national honor or just honor in general, I think that is a facet of fascism. It's part and parcel of the whole thing. And there's nothing, I wouldn't say it's about, to psychoanalyze these guys. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's about culture and what kinds of virtues, secondary virtues, not just being on time, but loving your country, how those can get distorted in ways that make people not just resent people they regard as outsiders or who don't have those secondary virtues, but actually make you take action to correct things so that you don't feel disempowered anymore.
But we can blame the propaganda of the state or whatever that exacerbated this manufactured shame, right? These people would have never done this on their own volition. It takes propaganda in order to motivate people to this degree, no?
I mean, I think propaganda is really important, and particularly what we're talking about is a kind of politics of resentment. And if you gin that up, if you make that into a big machine, and one of the sort of innovations, for example, I mean, you think today about, I was listening to NPR, and there was a colleague who was talking in a really interesting way about the like mechanism on Facebook and how what that did is get people not just to repeat things, but gin up your emotions. You get really emotionally involved, right? And so this is apparently a very, it's a new moment, right? Well, around the turn of the century, the new moment is that you get mass newspaper ownership. And in Germany, traditionally, they hadn't been around that long, but you'd have like a newspaper in a town, and it was just reporting on what was in the town, and maybe they would have a correspondent in Berlin or something like that. But what happens is several people buy up lots and lots of newspapers, and what they do is basically get rid of all the local journalists who are reporting on national issues, and they run the same story from the center even down to these little towns. And in particular, conservative newspapers ran stories that were essentially, if not propaganda, they were mendacious, they were lying, they were racist, they were misogynist. And it's really cheap. It made a lot of money for these people, and it was highly effective. So there's a technological moment, mass media, where everybody is becoming part of a larger discourse. And so, yeah, I do think that propaganda figures, that lying is really important. I would argue, in the Weimar Republic, it's the first time you really get a moment where you have what we would today call liberals, social democrats, who are saying, well, the facts are this, and you have conservatives, not Nazis, but conservatives who say, I don't care about the facts. This is a swamp. Socialists and Jews and women, they're all in this together, and they're destroying Germany. And the socialists would sit there and say, but that's not true. And when I say socialists, the social democrats were just liberals. They were not trying to nationalize industry. They weren't trying to take away people's property. They were committed to democracy and liberal capitalism with a little bit of a welfare net. And that's about it. And I mean little bit of a welfare net. So they're just trying to argue from facts, and it totally failed because there's no narrative. There's no story.
Wow. This is epic. This is what you're describing is so epic, because we're drawing, again, conclusions and jumping to conclusions about the age we live in right now. And what you just said is the consolidation of media. The technology in the early 20th century made it possible for them to consolidate the media to a degree where they could take it over and spread what we know spreads best, which is emotion rather than facts. Nobody wants to hear about the facts. And the last 20 years in America, we've seen the consolidation of media to be ever more corporate, to where it went from 50 newspapers down to 4. So kind of scary.
I think even worse, it's, this politics of emotion, the Facebook argument or the Twitter argument that you make money off of people reading stories. So how do you get people to read stories? Well, it's inflammatory, it's incendiary. You're not really worried about whether or not it's true. You just want to appeal to people's emotions, get them really pissed off. And the more pissed off they are, the more they consume it, the more money you make. So, if around the turn of the century, you're talking about I'm thinking of two particular conservative newspaper empires in Germany. Today, I don't even think it's about whether or not you're on the right or the left. It's a capitalist model, and it simply depends on this emotional response. And you're absolutely right, at least from where I sit. The factual information isn't as interesting. It's boring. It's bland. Who cares about facts? I want to read a story about, the human interest story, the dog that comes back 10 years later to the owner, or how evil politicians are, or, a bank robber, or something like this. My world becomes all of the identifications I have emotionally and politically, rather than thinking about, I don't know, how to actually construct my retirement, or the fact that I have a neighbor and the two of us see each other all the time and it's nice to live wherever I live. All these sorts of things are not, or urban planning, right? Affordable housing. These kinds of things seem so far away and remote. Why should I actually feel anything about them? Oh, well, I'll feel something about them once you racialize it. Once you tell me black people want to live near where I want, then I don't want to hear it.
Environmental issues, completely too obscure and abstract to care about, unless they're dumping toxic waste in your backyard and your wife sprouts up a whole bunch of tumors. Then it's your, this is like the classic conservative limitation of how much they can empathize with other people.
Yeah. I think, there's no question that empathy is one of the bigger issues, although I wouldn't say that empathy necessarily translates into politics very well, right? It can be a political moment, but it's not enough to sustain, think about affordable housing. Just because you empathize with people who are homeless doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to vote for a particular plan. So it's not enough, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, maybe I should take my show and turn it into like a more socialist, liberal, like Rush Limbaugh, where I'm just screaming like about how everybody should have freedom. Or like,
does that mean that you have to get hooked on oxycodone?
Yeah, probably. No problem, man. No, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Vitriol sells. It was like in the Hearst days. He knew that lies spread faster, and then they know if you lie enough, then the lie will somehow become true over time. And this is just the fatal flaw in the weak brain that we have, really. So I want to ask you about, obviously, we'll go back to the Holocaust and the slow kind of bureaucratic, it started from a bureaucratic inconvenience and escalated to an unimaginable genocide. What were some of the like very distinctive steps where it escalated? Because this is what I'm watching for in our current predicament.
So maybe the best way to think about it is that even before 1933, there are attempts to basically remove Jews from the economy. So one of the ways that looks, imagine for a second that you have a license to sell something. An example that a colleague of mine has is eggs, right? People sell eggs, they sell butter, they sell things like this. You need to have a license to do that because nobody wants rotten eggs. And the city needs to regulate and make sure that your eggs are going to be fine. And the city simply revokes the licenses for Jews to sell eggs. So just as an example, and that happens sometimes in some cities before 33, but it certainly happens after 33. The same is true of any kind of city services. You just revoke licenses if you think that and people draw up lists, not just Nazis draw these lists up, but Nazis draw them up too, of local business people who they think are Jewish. And sometimes they're wrong because it's not always clear who's Jewish. You can have a Jewish sounding name and they'll still go after you. And of course, if you're not Jewish, people who get victimized in that way, they get really loud and really angry. So this is happening already. But I would say there are a lot of people in the party or sympathetic to the party who also just want Jews out of the country. So on the one hand, there's a kind of attempt to ratchet up the pressure on Jews and get them to leave. And sure enough, a lot of Jews, mainly the ones who I think accurately understand the danger, young people who can just pick up and leave, people who might know another language or be willing, young enough to just do something different in a different culture, and people who have some money. But again, people who understand that there's a threat, they do leave in 33 and 34. But not enough to leave for the more radical Nazis. So the sort of paradox here is, on the one hand, there's a growing attempt to expel Jews using legislation and pressure and undermining their livelihood. On the other hand, the party and the state want to make money off Jews. They accuse Jews of being greedy. The Nazis are so corrupt. I think we think of them as these incredibly efficient, upright, zealous ideologues. They're definitely ideologues. They're fanatic very often. And that, by the way, was a good thing in the interwar period. People spoke well of fanaticism. Today, it has a really bad aftertaste for us. But in any case, they were very corrupt, in fact. And you have a lot of people, ordinary people, saying some version of, Jews are really dishonest, and everything they own is ill-gotten gains. And we need to return to the German people, and I'm an Aryan, and so I get to have that. You have people applying to the party and the state for that, but you also have party officials saying this in a larger sense. So you want to steal from Jews. You want to steal property that they own and call it Jewish property, and then sort of purge it of its Jewishness and make it possible for you to have it. But the problem with that is the more you impoverish them, the less likely they can leave, because places like America, it's really hard to get a visa. It's very expensive. And then you also have to pack up your belongings and, if you can at all, pay for them to go across the Atlantic. So very few people over time can do this. Over time, you're impoverishing them to the point where, and since they're no longer able to draw on welfare or community services, they're totally cut off. They should be wards of the state, but the state doesn't like them, and they have no capital. They're not going to go anywhere. So in a way, this is the sort of odd thing about fascists. They're completely confused about what they want to do. And to go back to your question about the Holocaust, I mean, I think it really does require the war for it to become a genocide. The violence against people, you can't call it bullying, but the sort of Gestapo search and seizure moments where they just go into people's houses, the fact that you can be hit on the street, people can do horrible things to you, that you can only over time buy groceries at a certain time, and then you can only buy certain kinds of groceries. And as time goes on, especially when the war hits, there's less and less food you're allowed to purchase. So all of these things it's kind of a tightening of the noose. And yet Nazi leadership in particular, but a lot of local Nazis don't even want these people in their country. They want them to leave. When the war cuts off that avenue of escape, I think that's when the paradox is, let's say, dissolved. And the only possibility, and there have been people who've been saying we have to get rid of these people one way or the other. The only way to get rid of them is to forcibly expel them and not allow them to go anywhere. In other words, to kill them. So I think it's partially the war and all of another way to think about it is German troops commit atrocities constantly. So the initial invasion of Poland, German ordinary soldiers are killing Polish civilians, but also Jews. And this is a problem for leadership. It's undisciplined from a military perspective. That's a problem. But it's also a problem for leadership in the sense that Hitler's quite jealous of his powers. And so are other Nazi leaders. So you can't just have ordinary people committing murder and atrocities. It needs to be organized so that you can take back the power. But you also want it to be sustained. You don't want people to get drunk and beat people up or kill people, because then what happens is they get exhausted. It's close up and personal. Maybe some people get revolted by it. And on top of it, then you have these corpses that you've got to do something with. Instead, plan it, organize it. So when you said it's a bureaucratic inconvenience, I wouldn't say it's an inconvenience. It's that it's a story of increasing bureaucratization, which means both that it's really well organized over time, but also it becomes more abstract. So instead of shooting people up close, where you can recognize it's a human being whose life you're extinguishing, and it's gory, right? I mean, killing somebody, for all the sort of movies and video games, killing somebody is not easy, even for people who are trained to do it. And of course, they're trained to kill soldiers. They're not trained to kill, even the SS, really not trained to kill civilians. So it's gory work. You get, sorry to say this to your viewers, but, you get splatter, and your gun jams, all kinds of awful stuff. Why not actually remove that personal moment so that your morale and all of the exhaustion and the resources, you can reduce the number of people that you need to kill another set of people, by doing things like creating gas chambers.
Yeah.
So,
This is where I think where intellectual people really see it for what it was. And it's extra disgusting when it becomes an industrialized effort using machines. And there's this great example where, people used to be hung in the town square for, people that did horrible, horrible crimes. They would do public executions and stuff. But there were so many examples of people starting to feel bad for those people right at the last minute that every time after they'd execute one of these people, there would be just a full-on riot. And so what they decided to do over time is to take things like prisons and executions and put them as far away from the cities, as far away from the public eye that they can to like, first of all, institutionalize it, give it this modern kind of way about it, but then also keep it out of the eyes of the people that might have any sympathy for these people.
I think that is part of the story, although it isn't the case that people didn't know. And there are, of course, so we think there are about 44,000 plus concentration camps. Not all of those were extermination camps. Most of them were work camps. But that means that small towns in Germany had their concentration camp throughout, let's say after 35. Sometimes it would have been closed down, but most of the time, starting in 33, all the way through the war, you would have people, communists, social democrats, and Jews, and Romani, who would be forced to work. So here I kind of want to, we were talking about this before, I just want to make it really clear. Conservatives like to say, well, it's National Socialism, so they must have been socialists. Nothing could be further from the truth. That was one of those bait and switch things.
Misnomer.
The Nazi Party, in a way, it was a kind of pyramidal scheme in terms of how it was organized financially. But when it comes down to the way that the Holocaust itself, or the genocide against the Jews and the Romani, and the attacks on Slavs functioned, it was about working people, extractive, capitalist organization. So you had people in towns who were working for not just local companies or, say, the city, shoveling snow and things like that, but you had Polish and Russian and Ukrainian men and women who were working on farms, but also sometimes as domestics, as maids. So about a third of the German workforce by 1944 are forced laborers who've been schlepped from Poland, Ukraine, and other places in the East and Russia. So think about that for a second. 1 in 3 workers are essentially slaves, and they've been brought here against their will. They're treated really badly, and you're going to meet them. You're going to see them in the street. You might even have one who's working with you, or several. So to sort of say that this whole machinery, that people don't know about it, I don't think that's true. Not only that, but some of the concentration camps, Dachau's right outside of Munich. Everybody knew what Dachau was who lived in Munich. There's Oranienburg in Sachsenhausen in Berlin. Major cities had, you can call them detention camps, if you like, because they weren't extermination camps, but they are killing people. Buchenwald is not far from Weimar. It's on a hill. People supposedly, this is from what I understand, could actually smell the burning flesh. So to sort of think that it's a regime that was saying what it wanted to do, that doesn't necessarily mean that after 45, we come up with the word genocide to describe the attempt to eliminate an entire group of people. I don't think you could ask Germans before that, or Jews, their victims in general, what a genocide was, because it's unthinkable in some ways. But that doesn't mean that people didn't know that there was mass extermination.
Well, that's a good question. Did they know? Obviously, when we went in there, it was a surprise to us that these camps existed. But the people,
it wasn't a surprise.
We knew the West.
Auschwitz is a good example. The U.S. Air Force did flyovers constantly. You can go online and take a look at the aerial photograph. And
so did those people tell the American people what in that time? No. They say, look at what's going on over here. We got.
Let's put it like this. It appeared in newspapers that the Jews there were not just atrocities, but that there was an attempt to kill Jews on a large scale. That was starting in 42. Okay. A lot of good information had been smuggled out, mainly from Poland. So it hit newspapers. It was reported on. I think for the military and for the civilian leadership in Britain and the United States, The bigger problem was, how do you defeat the Nazis? Not only that, but there was some anti-Semitism. So it was regarded as a kind of, it's a goal, but it's a subsidiary goal. And we really need to hit the train station rather than hit the concentration camp and save lives. So the information inside of government was really quite good. And there are all kinds of reasons, none of which I think at the end of the day, from a military perspective or from a political perspective, make much sense. We could have intervened, we should have intervened, we did not intervene.
Yeah, so we had the intelligence. That's frightening. Well, back to the Germans, as far as the start of the camps, and did the German people know about it, and how did the approval of them with normal people in Germany, did they ebb and flow, or were people outraged at first, but then grow and say, okay, this is fine later, or?
So the story of the camps, I mean, I think you have to start really in 1933 with what are called the wild concentration camps. So the SA, immediately upon the takeover I shouldn't say takeover, because it's not a takeover. It's a completely legitimate, inside of the collapse of democracy, Hitler's appointed chancellor. The Nazis are the biggest party. So you can make all kinds of arguments about why he should become chancellor. He's appointed chancellor. The SA set up essentially in jails, if you like, in every single town, medium-sized city, and large city. And they set these up. They usually are working with Nazi sympathizers or Nazis themselves who are property owners, so a warehouse. And they go after communists first. Remember that there's been an enormous amount of tension between communists and Nazis, but in general, the Nazis had been able to convince people that the real threat to Germans was communism, which was foreign in the sense that it was the party was directed from Moscow. It was foreign in the sense that they were supposedly Jewish, and we could go on, right? So they were anti-German in some way. And what people saw was that there would be street fighting between the Nazis and the communists, and the Weimar cops would either not do anything, not be able to do anything, or help the Nazis out. So the Nazis were able to pose as kind of law and order types. So when they round up communists in 1933, and they really do go after communists and then social democrats in the beginning, not so much Jews, a lot of people were relieved. I mean, when I first started living in Germany, good friends with a Jewish couple, and I will never forget, he was slowly dying, unfortunately. His health had been compromised because of he went underground, and at any rate, he was slowly dying. And I just remember at one point at dinner, I said something, I don't remember what, and he became apoplectic and said, communists were worse than the Nazis. And this is a man who had suffered at the hands of the Nazis. So I think what that tells you is that a lot of people, especially middle-class people, were so afraid of communism that, especially if they weren't Jewish, saw in what the Nazis were doing to communists, okay, it's not really a good thing from a democratic perspective, but we haven't really been dealing with democracy, and we don't really like democracy so much since at least 1930. So, they're cleaning things up. They're really cleaning the streets up. So everybody knew about that. And in fact, I don't know how true this is because it's really hard to demonstrate, but I have read before that people would, like my mom would say to me, finish up your food, because if you don't, they're starving people in other parts of the world. Supposedly, mothers said, finish up your food or we'll send you to Dachau. Behave correctly, we'll send you to Dachau. So, Dachau was really widespread. There were newspaper articles about it, lauding it as a tool of law and order and a kind of deterrent. So people knew what concentration camps were. They understood the whole idea behind it. But the idea that you would have an extermination camp, which is that you're going to go after not simply communists, social democrats, and Jews and incarcerate them, but actually murder them in large numbers. That doesn't happen until the war. That's really hard to think about. I think people knew in general that the camps themselves, there's hard labor. It's not fun. That there's a possibility you will be killed because there's no law in that sense. You may well deserve to go there. A lot of people thought, they didn't know Jews, or they were indifferent to Jews, or Jews in general are bad, but the one who lives on my street, I know him. He's not so bad. When he gets taken away, well, what are you going to do? He's culpable because other people are culpable, and he's going off somewhere else, and I don't need to know about it. And I think that's what it is. People kind of knew that it was really bad, but the details, right? When soldiers come back from the front, they either talk about it or they do not talk about it at all because it's so horrifying.
Yeah. So what was the, I mean, obviously this was a combination to be able to do that to another person and become like, oh yeah, he's my neighbor, he's okay, and then become indifferent or to be hateful the entire time. It's an incredible parlor trick of some kind where you really convince. So were there financial problems? Like what happened before the decade before?
So I think part of what the Nazis try and do is, using the word segregation, I know it has a very specific meaning in the United States, but I think it's fair to call it a form of segregation. You could argue that in some ways the Nazis were trying to return to that point before Jews are granted civil rights, where they were segregated by law, not allowed to reside in cities and towns and things like this, could be refused at city gates. So the idea is that you've got a curfew, you have to, over time, you can only live in certain places, you're collected into neighborhoods and into specific houses. So that Jew that you knew is being accused of all kinds of terrible things. Over time, the kind of social relations you might have with them are attenuated because, there's less pressure on you not to really have anything to do with them. And then they may actually be moved into a so-called Jew house away from your neighborhood. And then you have no contact with them. There are people who were kind of heroic who would go and visit Jews. Sometimes it was, we talk about sort of white fragility and things like that, but sometimes it was a way of saying, well, I'm a good person because I'm bringing some food to someone who's Jewish. In other words, it's about them and their identity, not about the person who's suffering. But some people really did try and help. It's just that it became harder and harder, not just socially, but in terms of actually finding people and talking to them. And people denounced each other a lot. Why did they denounce each other? Well, sometimes it was for financial gain. I was last year was doing some research on the city of Würzburg and the way that Jews were deported. And there was a guy who wanted a backpack. And as soon as he heard that Jews were being deported, he made a formal request to have a backpack because he wanted a backpack. So people would denounce each other. Another situation where someone denounced somebody else just for a bicycle. It's pretty clear it's about economic opportunism. Some people are anti-Semitic and they just really don't like Jews and want to do terrible things to them or have other people do terrible things to them. But sometimes it's just, I'm a good upstanding citizen and I see somebody over there doing something, if you see something, you say something. I always find that, I know what the intent is behind that phrase, but for someone who studies German history, it's
either sycophantic, tattletale, like bootlicker.
It gets rewarded. Yeah,
you're a good boy, good boy. You did so good.
Yeah. And people can make the argument about civil courage that it's a very American thing because of, the way in which we threw off colonial ties and libertarianism in the United States. It's true that there isn't the same sort of let's say, libertarian impulse in some ways, so that there isn't the same kind of civil courage. I remember when I was a journalist in Germany, and a man who later on turned out to be Egyptian I was working in Frankfurt, and he started getting harassed by a bunch of essentially bankers, right? It was completely racist. Basically, the train was moving back and forth, and he bumped into one of these guys, and they started insulting him and pushing him back and forth, and nobody did anything. And I stood up and I said, you can't do this. This is not okay. This is a person too. And they threw me and him off the train. So and nobody did anything. And these are bankers. These are not like thuggish types. Well, I don't know.
Well, in a bureaucratic sense, absolutely, they're fine.
Yeah, well, they were traders, so
aristocratic sense, yeah, bullies.
Bond traders, desk traders, they had this kind of frat boy thing going on.
I find a correlation there, yeah.
In any case, I think that you can make all those kinds of arguments, but what we have to remember is that the entire country was the government. You mentioned propaganda. There are measures that are taken that make it harder and harder to maintain ties to Jews. So it makes it easier to be indifferent. I always say to my students, I see homeless people in Boston, and it is at this time of year really horrendous to be homeless because it was below zero today, Fahrenheit. Celsius.
Yeah.
That was below zero Fahrenheit would be far worse. Yeah, no, and so this is really dangerous. It's a really serious problem. And yes, I give money. and I volunteer with my kids, but it's not the same as actually changing everything. And most people look at a homeless person and say, that's a real shame. And then they walk on by. We all do that. It's not enough what we do. So I think there's a kind of similar mechanism there, where there's nobody speaking up for them. So why should you speak up for them? Why should you be the person to do that?
And I've talked to a lot of people on this show about the inherent points about capitalism and this endless competition and the profit motive that warps our values down to that degree where you can walk past a homeless person and say, well, not my problem, that's his fault. While, just socialism, just absolutely reminding us that we have evolved for millions of years as a community,
No, that's a really good point. And I'm trying to be as fair as I possibly can. But obviously, there are lots of Germans who think that Jews are getting what's coming to them.
Right.
And deserve it.
Yeah. And we're saying that, again, all across the board throughout history. Race is a great boogeyman when you're financially in dire straits and your culture is on the back burner and you're becoming irrelevant and going through hard times. And it's like, well, I need a scapegoat. I absolutely need somebody to blame. So we've talked about communism a little bit. I think it's really, really interesting that communists were the first to be kind of persecuted. Where did the beginning of these things in the early 20th century in Germany, obviously they got scared in 1917. They saw things happening in Russia. The communists actually had a shot there. What was the big fear? Why were they so afraid of things like this?
Well, I think so. Let's call it socialism because there's lots of different forms of socialism in the 19th century, but most of them were anti-capitalist at some level. Some of them were revolutionary. Some of them were interested in using the parliamentary system to change things from the inside. But it's all sort of, what would I say? I don't know. When the Germans defeat the French in 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, you get the Commune, and there is this sort of brief moment where the city of Paris is taken over by a group of people they're sort of a motley crew of nationalists, socialists, anarchists, lots of different kinds of people. And that's a bit of a shock that people who are not part of the elite could take over. But in 1917, you have complete outsiders taking over. And I mean outsiders not only in terms of never having they were criminalized, they sat in jail, they don't have any government experience whatsoever, but they're also ethnically other, a lot of them. I mean, Stalin is a Georgian, not a Russian. We could go on. So I think it's really shocking not only that you have these outsiders taking over, but you have a real revolution. And it's a revolution that is promising to change property relations. And the way this sounds in the minds of people who have a lot of property, it's very threatening, right? And the people have a lot of power, very threatening. And what they do is they manage to make even middle-class people think that their apartments are going to be taken from them. And, well, you laugh, but it's true that the Bolsheviks did do some of that, right? If you had a really large apartment.
I laugh because I see it today.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is in Germany you have the Wohngemeinschaft, this idea that lots of people live together, and it's a large apartment and it works. I mean, my experiences with living with lots of people who I didn't, who weren't my best friends, and I choose to live together in an apartment, it works really well, actually. And that's the sort of, there are good things that came out of that, but there are some bad things too, right? There's theft. There's no question that the Soviets are involved in stealing from people, not for personal use, but they do take things away from people. And so that is a really big fear for people in power in Germany, but also people who are the opposition, liberals, opposing conservatives, because they also are, the conservatives tend to be agrarian types. They are big landowners, and the liberals tend to be involved with factories, or they're lawyers. They're, in other words, people who are supposed to help people who have large factories or large plantation-style farms. So this is all very threatening to people. And I think it's more about the fear than the reality, because the likelihood that there would be an actual Soviet government in Germany is very small for a bunch of reasons. You do have Soviet republics in some cities. So take the city of Bremen, for example. It has a Soviet republic. They abolish money. They commandeer bakeries and things like that. They go bankrupt within about 2 weeks. And everything is chaotic. And so when the Freikorps Gerstenberg gets in there, basically everything has fallen apart already. Of course, that doesn't stop the Freikorps from shooting people, because that's kind of what they do, and they hate communists. And they think that half the communists are Jewish anyhow. So there's this kind of way in which those kinds of Soviet republics, some of which are highly unsuccessful and very fleeting, some of which have a little bit more staying power, that allows people to think about this fear as if it's a reality. And you have the Spartacus uprising, which is totally misguided and also didn't have much chance of winning out. There was not any kind of popular resentment the way that Lenin and Trotsky could build on in the Soviet Union, or what became the Soviet Union. So I think it's about fear in Germany. And if you just take a look at the way that the communists poll, they do well in times of crisis. So they reach a sort of a high point in 23, but they're not really sure what they're going to do. And so one arrangement is to support the social democratic government in Thuringia. And this is regarded as a revolution. And so the liberal, it's a German liberal, which is so, we would regard that person, Stresemann, as being extremely right wing. He calls out martial law and puts down the social democratic as well as the communist government, even though it was totally peaceful and they weren't going to try and nationalize anything, steal people's apartments or anything like that. So there are these moments where the right is really able to play on people's fears because there's enough of a reality there to make people worried. The Nazis come later, and they've been saying the whole time that communists and Jews are the same, that they're really out to get you. They're not just going to steal they say things sometimes, it ranges from a kind of pornographic, they're going to violate your women. And again, that masculinity moment raises its head, all the way over to, they're not German. So there's lots of different ways, but the Nazis are more coherent and more anti-communist than probably any other group. And there's something about that kind of consistency that over time starts to attract people more and more. If you're anti-communist, you get pulled into this. And as we know today, there are plenty of people on the right who are really worried about communism in the United States, even though it's just not a thing. But there are also liberals. So social democrats, they see that there are two revolutions in the Soviet Union, what becomes the Soviet Union, I shouldn't say Soviet Union, in Russia. The first one is a liberal revolution, and they sign on to work with the liberals to reform things through parliamentary democracy. And they get outflanked in a kind of coup. It does have a popular basis, but it's still a coup when Lenin decides that that's not a good idea. And the problem is, over time, what Lenin does is he forces social democrats, and these are people who they're interested in parliamentary democracy. They want to reform society using democratic means, not through a revolution. We do it slowly over time, gradually, and with consent. Lenin forces them either to join the party and become Bolsheviks or to leave. And this kind of thing was happening a little bit in the German Social Democratic Party. And so Social Democrats, particularly the first president, Ebert, of the Weimar Republic, who was a saddler by trade, a leather worker by trade, and what we would call right-wing social democrat, really just a liberal. He was a nationalist. He was very much dedicated to Germany, even though the right said, well, if you're a socialist, you're an international, you can't possibly be German. He looked at the people on his left flank and was really worried that they were going to mount a coup. And so when they do, there's no choice for the government but to actually take action. So there's a rift between, let's say, democratic socialists and socialists who are not democratic. That's what drives some of these problems. And so some of the fiercest anti-communists are actually on the left, not on the right. But you also have this kind of really crazy conspiracy theory thing that is being pushed by people who are conservative but also on the far right, which is a somewhat different kind of beast, because they're saying things that are just not really tracking any kind of reality. Whereas the Social Democrats, I think, really do have this concern about how their party should work, and should you be democratic or should you not be democratic? And they're very angry with the people inside of their own party. And the tragedy of German communism is that these Freikorps, these people who are proto-fascists, or maybe just you could call them fascists, they're just not Nazis. They murder some of the leaders of German communism, and that makes it harder to withstand the Stalinization of the party. So it makes it even more, it's easier for the Nazis and for others to say, well, they're just foreigners. They say they're German, but in fact, they're being run from Moscow. So there's nothing German about them. And not only that, but actually by the time we're talking late 20s, there aren't any Jews anymore really in positions of power at the very top of the party, but they still get labeled somehow or another as Jews.
And it was really shocking that I didn't know that, at any time in a capitalist society, these 2 or 3 or 5 choices that you have in political parties generally still all represent corporate interest to a degree where if you say the word communism, then the right and the left will both invariably go insane and say, no, absolutely not.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a kind of meltdown moment for people when they hear the word communism. We've got the Cold War to have dealt with, and that was, I think, really important to American national identity.
Sure.
But if you even think that to the side for a second, I don't want to make communists out to be, I would call them Marxist-Leninists. I wouldn't call them communists because they don't really see themselves as communists in quite the same way that we would. But there are people who distort Marxism and really do things that Marx argued against in a lot of ways. So one of the political moments I'm trying to make, it's an intellectual one, it's a political one, is that I think Marx would have had a lot of problems with what people like Lenin and certainly Stalin were doing. But even if we try and preserve the Marxist moment, the point is that these people, the last social democratic chancellor of Germany, Hermann Müller, who was chancellor from 28 to 30, he said openly, I've never read Marx. They were just not Marxists. So this kind of moment where you think about what we call communists, they were really violent. The Nazis learned a lot from their tactics when it came to disrupting parliament to show that it was incompetent, a bad way of doing business for society. They were anti-Semitic, incredibly anti-Semitic. They set up a dictatorship, the second German dictatorship. I would really say the third, because I think Imperial Germany was highly dictatorial. I'm not sure it's a dictatorship, but at any rate, the East German regime, I think you can play around with it and say that it wasn't as dictatorial, et cetera, and so forth. It was a dictatorship. It wasn't like the Nazis. They did not commit genocide. And while there was racism, it was a kind of complex racism, and it ran against the sort of official policy. Still existed, but it isn't like the Nazi dictatorship. It's at the same time, they ruin people's lives. So I don't feel comfortable, even in a German context, saying that the KPD in the Weimar period or the post-1945 Marxist-Leninists who run East Germany, that's like an alternative to whatever was going on in West Germany. I don't want to say that. West Germany, of course, is a really, in the first 20 years, very brown, lots of fascists in positions of authority and power, which is very distressing, not just in terms of wanting justice in some way for the crimes they committed. Sometimes these are people who committed atrocities, but just the whole flavor of West German Republic. But there is something about liberal democracy, and that includes capitalism, I would say. It was able to reform itself. The Germany today, with all of its warts, and it has, the coup attempt, which, it's really kind of bizarre. Right. It's bizarre at one level, but really it's about the Bundesverfassungsschutz trying to rehabilitate itself, the German version of the FBI, trying to demonstrate that it's actually loyal to democracy, because there were so many questions, given that it was working with people who clearly were anti-democratic, right, and racist and violent. And so that's a good moment, I think, even if it was a little bit of overkill. But there's something about liberal democracy that does enable these positive moments of development and change. And the whole point of dictatorships, I think in the sense is if there's going to be change, it has to be some kind of stasis that allows that dictatorial elite to replicate itself going forward. And what's bizarre about the Nazis is that they don't seem to have thought in those terms. It's one of the few dictatorships that just radicalized constantly. And there's something bizarre about that because of that radical dynamic.
Radicalization for radicalization's sake, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a kind of, reductio ad absurdum or kind of developmental logic here that, there's something conservative about East Germany at a certain point. They're just trying to maintain. And of course they fail. The Nazis are doing things that are in tune with some of their ideas that make no sense practically. Why commit genocide if you're losing the war? I mean, intellectually, I can explain to you why they thought that was a good idea, but they're losing the war. Why not pour all your resources into trying to win the war?
A twisted ideology about really trying to do something for the generations of Germans 100, 200 years into the future. He really thought that he was going to be doing something good by exterminating a certain group of people, which is... I
think, as we know, villains never like to see themselves as villains, right? There's something, it's emancipatory, and you get rid of all the Jews. You're emancipating the world of this.
When you really come around to believing the bullshit when you're really drinking your own Kool-Aid, then yeah, sure, this will happen. But yeah, as far as communism goes, I have a soft spot for socialism, communism. Like I saw this thing the other day, said, people say socialism looks good on paper, doesn't work in real life. And I say capitalism doesn't even look good on paper.
Yeah. So one way to think about socialism is that it really is a kind of product of capitalism. It's a protest against all those things that don't look good on paper, but we also experience in real life and we have problems with. We were talking about the homeless, the fact that capitalism does make most people prosperous, certainly compared to what a subsistence economy would look like 500 years ago. But there are all these other people who, don't live. People used to say about West Germany, it's the 2/3 society. 1/3 is doing really badly so that 2/3 can do well. There are always people who are not doing well in a capitalist society. And the problem is the ideology is not that we should be helping them. And that ideology that says we should be helping them, that's egalitarian, is socialism. So in a lot of ways, it is a protest against the shortcomings of capitalism. And you can certainly see it that way. It's a critique that is produced by capitalism. And that's why it probably is not going to disappear until capitalism disappears. So all those people who sit there and hope that communism or socialism will fade, they need to look to themselves, because they're the people who are producing the kind of protests that they don't like.
Yeah, as long as there's exploitation, hopefully people will have the gumption to stand up and say, you know what, I'm pretty sick of this. I want something different. And at least there are tiers. Like I lived in America, I was homeless, I traveled around, I saw just the absolute worst kind of denigrating ways that we can treat other human beings, and just anti-community, anti-everything. And then you come to Germany, and it's like a little bit better. At the moment, you have social safety nets, you have things, and they just never, I don't know how long they've been like this, but they've been here for a while, and for that, the people are more sane. The crime is lower, etc. But they still have their problem with right-wing police. I've ran into plenty of police here that say that I'm a dirty foreigner.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Wow. And as a way to justify whatever they're doing to you?
Well, everybody that is out there knows that I'm going to be going to court on January 19th because I grew weed on my porch. And so, but it took 25 super steroided out fascist German police to come and scream at me and tell me that you're in Germany now, you speak German, over and over, which...
What does that have to do with... so first of all, 25, that seems, again, overreach is probably not the right word. But, you're obviously scaring the shit out of somebody. But for weed, why do you have to speak German because you have weed? Is there something un-German about growing it?
Like the idea that I'm here in this country and that I need to start.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a very German concept, right?
So I've been told, yeah.
Yes. It is a very German concept.
Right.
Störenfried, Nestbeschmutzer. Yeah. So I don't know what to say about that. I can tell you my own story about that.
Sock it to
me. Before I turned to history. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sock it to me. I love it. Yeah.
So at a certain point, so I was a journalist, and then I was casting about for things to do, and ended up working at the University of Bonn. And then I went back to journalism. But anyway, I was working at the University of Bonn, and one night came home and was living in this like really horrible apartment complex. And they had it's like one of these terrible apartment complexes that pretends it has balconies, but they're not balconies you can use. So the ledges. And I went to sleep, and I got woken up by some guy who was really drunk, and I realized he's on the ledge, and he's yelling his head off, and he's really drunk, and it's not really a balcony. I don't know how he got up there, but it's not really a balcony, so he's going to fall because he's really drunk, and he lets his pants down, and he's masturbating, and he's focused on the woman right next to the apartment, right? I'd never seen her before. It's like this apartment building that was completely anonymous, never saw her come and go. She never saw me come and go. So we're like looking at him and then looking at each other. So I go and I say, okay, he's going to fall and he's going to die. We're on the second floor. He's, that's going to be the end of the guy.
What a way to go out.
We want to go to sleep, right? And we don't have to deal with this. And he's becoming more aggressive and all this kind of stuff. So I call the police, right? And, it was 5 guys, and so 4 guys and 1 woman. I'm relatively short. These people were over 2 meters, right? They're just like gigantic. And I was this very left-wing student. I had been spending a lot of my time going behind the Iron Curtain and just like traveling and meeting people and soaking up how different all this was, and I had brought back all this agitprop stuff. So I had all this agitprop, Lenin poster. No, it wasn't like Honecker was my ideal or anything like that, but I had Lenin, I had this, I had that, and slogans, right? A bunch of different slogans. And I was a poor student. Well, no, I wasn't really a student at that point. I was working, but I was still pretty poor. So nothing was framed. It was just sort of plastered on the with tape, right? So they go after this guy, right? They sort of stand around, they're strategizing, and then they decide what they're going to do is they're going to distract him, and then 2 of them are going to pull him through a window. And they managed to distract him, pull him through the window. I mean, they basically sliced off part of his arm because they yanked him through the window so hard that the guy was, but he was so drunk he kind of didn't really notice that blood was pouring down his arm. They bundle him up. I mean, I'm telling you, these guys were huge, and I had a tiny apartment. It's like it was a studio apartment, right? So you're just like sleeping right in your kitchen, kind of thing. They bundle him up and they take him outside, and they don't let his feet touch the ground. And then the woman says to me, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like,
"What's wrong with me?"
Yeah. And she said, "What are all those posters? Are you a communist? Are you trying to undermine West German democracy?" And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want, And then I realized you do not make jokes with German policemen. I would learn this over and over again. Apparently, I never really learned it.
Most Germans just avoid the jokes. They might just go right over their head.
No, she got in my face, and she said, "I'll take you down to the station if you can't be serious about this." And she just warned me. It scared the shit out of me.
What year was this?
It's got to be, I want to say 86, 87.
West Germany, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, West Germany, yeah.
Holy shit, that's a great story.
So all of a sudden, and I was, clearly, I was ethnically other. Everything came together right at that particular moment. So, and I had the same sorts of stuff in East Germany, only it was more about how East German stuff worked, right? Driving down at one point in a car that was on loan from a friend with all the papers and my passport and all that, and go through a speed trap, get stopped by a FOPO, and the guy says, "Give me your papers." And it's like a stack of papers. Hand him the papers. And he goes back to his car, and about, 2 or 3 minutes later, he comes over and he says, "Can I have your papers, please?" And I look at him, I go, "I just gave you my papers." And he says, "Are you calling a representative of the people's, the peasants and workers republic a liar?" I'm like, no. Horrifying. Lots of situations like that, right? So police are police. They are.
This is a universal truth. No matter where you go in the world, if they're police, this is a certain kind of human being.
I do think there's something self-selecting about it. I want to say there's probably people who honestly believe they're trying to help, but the problem is they're so aggressive, probably because they're dealing with people who are aggressive all the time, but they're taking liberties, they bully, they aren't held accountable for a lot of the crap they do. And even when I was a journalist, I got beat up by the police at one point, even though I had my little journalist thing. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of it.
Yeah, well, you're talking to the right guy. I am not a fan of it. I'm always writing ACAB on everything. The reality is, this is a certain kind of person. And the reason why I say all cops are bastards is because the system itself that tells them to go out and do what they do. But it's something I researched about fascist personalities, or people have authoritarian personalities, where they tend to only listen to authority sources, and when it comes to doing the bidding of that authority, they do it with like more aggravated aggression than the actual authority would do. That they take their job really seriously as a sycophant, and they really want to do a good job and be told that they're good, but they're really looking for an excuse to use violence. This is what I think.
I would add in that maybe they didn't start off that way, but there's a kind of trauma. Again, they're not all the people they're dealing with are like me and you, no. Right? So a lot of them are, like this guy who was, naked on my balcony, right? How do you deal with a guy like that? And so they're having to do all kinds of stuff, and I think it radicalizes them. And then when they're being attacked, that's not fun. And so they take it out on other people. That's the problem. It's that they're not well equipped. Put the military shit aside and all the guns and weapons they have. They're just not emotionally equipped to do their job. And on top of it, like you say, a lot of them are the kind of people who want to take those liberties anyhow. So yeah, I know we need some kind of something to protect people, but it just doesn't seem to be working right.
Yeah. Well, as long as there are this personality type, or we have excessive amounts of testosterone, or whatever it is, that primitive instincts to want to hurt or kill or whatever, or control and everything, I don't know. Like, will we ever see the end of it? Really? Maybe not. So it's just something me and you, people like me and you, have to navigate it every freaking day, So
I think one of the weird things about being a German historian is that you end up thinking things are not as bad as they seem, because they can't be 1933 again. And then on the other hand, you're totally paranoid. Where are the signs of 1933? So when January 6th happened, I was like, of course that's what's happening. Right?
Everything about it, familiar as fuck. Familiar.
Yeah, it's different. It's very different, but you tend to sort of think the worst all the time, or just sit there and say, well, this is really bad, but it's not 1933.
Yeah. Just wait.
Yeah. I have been worried for the past 5 years. Very, very worried.
Yeah. Well, everybody should really be worried right now. And this is exactly why I had you on, so that we could talk about this. Because, I am concerned. We're going to cut it off here. We'll talk afterwards. I want to thank Jonathan Zatlin for coming on and just having a great conversation, telling some really good stories.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Would you come on, do it again?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
It was fun.
Anything? Thanks. Anything else you want to add before we go?
Sure, but let's save it for the next time.
Okay. All right. Deal. All right. Well, wave goodbye to everybody in TV land. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Okay. Thanks so much.